Good Thursday morning, everyone, and welcome into today's daily Bible reading for February the 2nd. So today we are reading together in Genesis chapter 39. Hope that you've had a good first half of the week and ready to make our way toward the weekend. Thanks so much for tuning in. Let me go ahead and get Genesis 39 up on the screen for us. We're told, there's actually, this is picking up from a previous chapter, not the immediately previous chapter, but from chapter 37, where we were told about Jacob being basically thrown away by his brothers, given to some traders. And it says that the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guards. And that is an important note for us to highlight, because that is a fulfillment of the promise, or at least the prediction that God had made with Abraham back in chapter 15 and verses 13 through 16 about his descendants living in a foreign land, being slaves for a period of time. This is progressing that they're working towards that reality, that his descendants would leave the promised land and would go somewhere else for a time and then make their way back to the promised land. So this section of Joseph's story helps to move that prediction forward. So reading here in Genesis chapter 39 and verse number 1, as we get back to the focus on Joseph again, once we are introduced to Jacob's sons back in chapter 37, the focus shifts off of Jacob specifically and onto his sons and the part that they are going to play in the story of God's people, specifically Joseph and Judah. We saw Joseph being highlighted in chapter 37, Judah highlighted in chapter 38. Now we're going to get back to the Joseph story, and Judah and the other brothers will show up in a few chapters as well. So let's go and get to reading here in Genesis chapter 39 and verse number 1. Genesis 39, verse number 1. Now Joseph had been taken to Egypt. An Egyptian named Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and the captain of the guards, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, serving in the household of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord made everything he did successful, Joseph found favor with his master and became his personal attendant. Potiphar also put him in charge of his household and placed all that he owned under his authority. From the time that he put him in charge of his household and of all that he owned, the Lord, Yahweh, blessed the Egyptian's house because of Joseph. And Yahweh's blessing was on all that he owned in his house and in his fields. He left all that he owned under Joseph's authority. He did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. Now, Joseph was well built and handsome, and after some time, his master's wife looked longingly at Joseph and said, "Sleep with me." But he refused. "Look," he said to his master's wife, "with me here, my master does not concern himself with anything in his house, and he has put all that he owns under my authority. No one in this house is greater than I am. He has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. So how could I do this immense evil? And how could I sin against God?" Verse number 10, although she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her. Now one day he went into the house to do his work, and none of the household servants were there. She grabbed him by his garment and said, "Sleep with me." But leaving his garment in her hand, he escaped and ran outside. When she saw that he had left his garment with her and had run outside, she called her household servants. "Look," she said to them, "my husband brought a Hebrew man to make a fool of us. He came to me so he could sleep with me, and I screamed as loud as I could. When he heard me screaming for help, he left his garment beside me and ran outside." She put Joseph's garment beside her until his master came home. Then she told him the same story. "The Hebrew slave you brought to us came to make a fool of me. But when I screamed for help, he left his garment beside me and ran outside." When his master heard the story his wife told him, "These are the things your slave did to me," he was furious and had him thrown into prison, where the king's prisoners were confined. So Joseph was there in prison. Verse 21, but the Lord, Yahweh, was with Joseph, and he extended kindness to him. He granted him favor with the prison warden, and the warden put all of the prisoners who were in the prison under Joseph's authority, and he was responsible for everything that was done there. The warden did not bother with anything under Joseph's authority, because Yahweh was with him, and Yahweh made everything that he did successful. And that is Genesis chapter 39. All right, so going back up and considering this text together, again, we find Joseph in Egypt now, and this is going to progress the story of Abraham's descendants being prisoners and slaves in a foreign land. This is kind of the segue to get them down to Egypt with this portion of the story and everything that's going to come in the next few chapters. But being where he was, the text says that Yahweh was with him. Now, this chapter 39, is the only chapter in which God's name is used. Yahweh is only used here in chapter 39. And I think that's important because it shows that this is the portion where God is absolutely going to be remaining faithful to his covenant. Remember, Yahweh is the covenant name of God. That name just speaks to his faithfulness to what he says. So here he is being with the descendant of Abraham. He is with Joseph, and he blesses Joseph, so much so that that Potiphar even sees this. Now, is this just great perception on the part of Potiphar, or was Joseph speaking to him about the power of his God? I don't really know. Don't really know what exactly the reason is, or how it is that Potiphar came to recognize that Joseph was blessed so much. But he notices it, and he finds favor in Potiphar's sight, and Potiphar put him in charge of everything. Everything was under his authority, and once he did that, then things were blessed even more. That Yahweh blessed the Egyptian's house because of Joseph. His blessings were on everything that he had, and this is certainly a good situation for not just Joseph, but for Potiphar as well. The text tells us that he left all that he owned under Joseph's authority. He did not concern himself with anything except the food that he ate. Now, there are some commentators and scholars that believe that last phrase, the food he ate, is actually a euphemistic phrase that is not actually referring to food, but it's referring to really only Joseph's or Potiphar's wife. That it would be a euphemism for his private affairs, chief most being his wife. So if we read that into the text, and if we understand if this is euphemistic, then that kind of sets us up for what we're going to see next. And it also makes a lot of sense when we consider what he says in verse number 9, where he says, referring to Potiphar, he has withheld nothing from me except you. Well, here it says food. There it says you. So maybe what Joseph says here helps us to understand the way that this should be understood. Whether that's the case or not, as we continue on, we're told that Joseph was well built and handsome. These are actually the same terms that were used, the Hebrew terms, the same terms that were used to describe Rachel, Joseph's mother. So apparently there were good looking genetics within that particular family. And unfortunately, this caused some problems for Joseph in the fact that Potiphar's wife, we'll call her Mrs. Potiphar. Mrs. Potiphar was like the typical Egyptian women. History tells us that Egyptian women were known for being a bit loose. So it is not very surprising that she would look longingly at this handsome young man and desire to have a sexual relationship with him. And she just flat out tells him, hey, sleep with me. But Joseph refused. Joseph refused, and he gives 3 reasons to refuse. The 2 of them seem practical, him just doing what was necessary to keep him in his position. But the third one really shows him that his refusals are based upon faith. Number 1, he says, I can't do this because my master has put everything that he owns under my authority. Number 2, he's withheld nothing from me except you alone. And then number 3, how could I do this immense evil, and how could I sin against God? Now, if you think about these reasonings, really these first 2 reasonings are really motivations to sin. You know, if I've been given everything, and if you're the only thing I don't have, then I should pursue that. You know what that sounds like? That sounds a lot like what took place in the garden. It was framed from the perspective of the serpent, that God's given you everything except this fruit, which will make you be like him. So therefore you should pursue it. So we kind of see that echo showing up here as well. But Joseph remains firm. He says, I can't do this. I cannot sin against God. And yet she was persistent. Although she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her until this one day, as Joseph's just going about his normal work, doing his normal thing, as he should be doing. For whatever reason, none of the household servants were there. I tend to think that she might have told him that they needed to go do something else. But it is at this time that she grabbed him by his garment and said, sleep with me. But he runs out his clothes. This is the second time now that we see Joseph's garment being taken away from him. Well, she's going to use this to her advantage, because she calls the household servants and she says, look, my husband, not Potiphar, but just my husband, brought a Hebrew man here, somebody, an outsider, somebody that's not with us, to make fools of us. And that term, to make fools of us, could mean to commit some sort of sexual sin against us, or just to mock us. Whatever it is, what she says happens is that he tried to sleep with me. I screamed as long as I could. He ran, and boom, here's his garment right beside it. He took off his garment. He was ready to rape me, and he took off once I screamed. So here's the evidence. And she holds on to that garment until Potiphar gets home, and she says the same story. The Hebrew slave you brought to us came to make a fool of me. Again, there are lots of echoes here from the garden. Think about Adam here, how Adam told God, the woman that you gave me led me to sin. So echoes that are showing up in the story time and time again. Potiphar's reaction to this is he was furious. But here's what I want to recognize. It doesn't say who he was furious with. Who was he furious with? Was he furious with his wife because she introduced this issue to him? Was he furious with Joseph? The text doesn't say that. Was he just furious at the situation and the fact that now he's lost his most valuable commodity within his home, his golden goose again, you might say? He's just furious. And if he was going to do what was the norm within Egyptian society, well, then he would be killed. Let me see here. I read something earlier that talked about what the normal punishment would be for this. I read somewhere, I don't see where it was now. I read somewhere, though, that the normal punishment for this would be like 1,000 lashings or something like that. And if not death, if that wouldn't kill you, then you could be put to death for what you did, for what Joseph is accused of doing here. But instead, he's thrown into prison. It's very interesting. He's thrown into prison. Now, some believe that Potiphar's position was over the prisoners, that his job as the way it's referred to as an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guards, that this would be him being over the prisons. This would mean he was very, very close with Pharaoh. Some even think that his job was basically to be the chief executioner. So he puts Joseph into prison, maybe because he doesn't necessarily believe his wife. Maybe what he's observed of Joseph leads him to have more confidence in Joseph than what his wife is telling him. Maybe that's the case. Maybe he's just want to keep him close. Again, if he's over the prisoners, if he's over the guards as well, then he's going to be close to this situation. Some even speculate that maybe his wife didn't want him to be put to death, so she asked him to be put into prison so she might take advantage of him another time later on. We just don't know. But whatever the case may be, he was put into prison instead of killed. And with this being a reality, he has the opportunity to continue to be blessed by God. The Lord was with Joseph. Again, Yahweh was with Joseph and extended kindness to him. He is a descendant of Abraham. Him being in Egypt is the way through which God's family of Abraham is going to continue to be blessed, and the way it's going to be continue to be preserved. And just as it was within Potiphar's house, the same it is here with the warden within the jail. The warden put all the prisoners who were in the prison under Joseph's authority. He was responsible for everything that was done there. The warden did not bother with anything under Joseph's authority because the Lord was with him, and the Lord the Lord was with him, and the Lord made everything that he did successful. Joseph, here within this story so far, he was doing the right things. He seems to be a hard worker, seems to be a man of integrity, and seemed to just do the right thing, generally speaking. But the one who made it all possible at the end of the day was the Lord. It was Yahweh. It was God. And we need to recognize that all throughout the story, again, is that when we see everything that's taking place here, we see that someone who was doing the right thing still suffered for doing the right thing. But God was with him in doing that right thing. God was faithful because Joseph was faithful to Yahweh and maintaining a strong moral standard. Yahweh continued to be with him and continue to bless him and to uphold him and to put him in the best situation possible. And again, we recognize that this is because the Lord is working something out in the life of Joseph so that he can be a blessing to his family and be that which preserves and maintains the lineage of the Messiah through the one to whom the promise was given, Abraham. So as we continue to look at this, read through this narrative of Joseph and everything that takes place, continue to recognize God's faithfulness in all this, and the fact that he is doing what is necessary in order to bring his promises to fruition. He does that whenever people do the right thing, as Joseph did within this chapter. But he also does that whenever people don't do the right thing, as we see in the previous chapter of Judah. So that leaves us with this thought then. As God is continually faithful to work out his promises, we have one of two options. We can either participate in that and work with God as he is working, or we can rebel against that and put ourselves in negative situations. God's will is still going to be done, but we will suffer for those bad decisions that we make. May each of us consider what a blessing it is to participate with God in his promises to us and to do the right thing by the strength that he provides and enjoy the blessings that he alone gives. I appreciate so much you tuning in for this reading on this Thursday. Looking forward to reading again with you tomorrow as we're in chapter 40 of Genesis, just about, I think 11 chapters left. Once we read tomorrow, 10 chapters after that, and we'll be done with our first text for this year, reading through Genesis. We'll move right in to Exodus. But reading tomorrow from Genesis chapter 40, we're going to look at Joseph interpreting some dreams and how that plays a part in the progression of the story continuing on. Again, thanks for reading along with me today. Looking forward to reading with you again tomorrow. Take care and God bless.